Good evening and welcome to our weekly book study here at New Covenant House. We are studying Christian Anarchism by Alexandre Christoyannopoulos, who wrote it as his doctoral thesis. We are in Chapter 3. There are 5 points in Chapter 3. Chapter 3 is mostly about the relationship between church and state, examining each of them and the relationship between them. Tonight, last couple of weeks, we went through the history from Pentecost up to about Reformation, because Reformation is dealt with in a separate chapter, Chapter 6, later on in the book, so we didn't get into that too much. It was a pretty dismal story. There is mostly based on power, not much about love and justice in the first many centuries of the church. Tonight we're going to start a small mini-series here, probably like 5 weeks or so, about the modern state. And tonight it's mostly about defining what is a state. And then we're going to go through 4 aspects of the state. We can just quickly say here the first of those aspects is violence. The state is violent and coercive. And then the second part is deception. And the third part is the economic exploitation that's the state is culpable of. And then finally, the state as idolatry. One problem with it is that anarchist writers, Christian anarchist writers, can't really agree on what state is. And they're not really concerned with it because they have probably like a basic idea what it is, and they use terms somewhat interchangeably. There is 4 terms that are being used: state, government, power, and authority. And the anarchist writers use state and government more than any of the other 2, and they use them pretty much interchangeably to mean the same, but that may not be true. State, I think, has to do, there are several aspects of state. For example, it can be just an administrative function. It takes taxes and using it for building roads and bridges and healthcare and social security and that kind of stuff. And then another aspect of state is the government, where you kind of have a social contract where you decide these are things that the state can do to govern your life. And I think that it's kind of mentioned that the power and authority is part of government. So in other words, state is the overall thing, and then underneath that is, part of that is government, and within government is power and authority. So if we have to define a little bit what these terms mean. Actually, one of the persons who is writing the most about this is a lady named Ruth Kinna, and I think she's actually a colleague of Alexandre Christoyannopoulos. They both teach at the same university in England. But I could be wrong about that, but that's what I think. She wrote some books, especially one that's the basics of what anarchism is, and it's not just Christian anarchism, but anarchism in general. And I have it on my wish list. I want to buy it and use it. But she's the one who's talking most about this stuff. And so she says there are 3 abstract concepts in the state. And that's what I think we just mentioned here. The number 1 is the government, which is the violence part. And then there is the social relationship, which is authority. The social contract is the relationship. How much of our lives do we allow the government to influence us? And the third aspect or concept, as she calls it, is the power with which the government can secure its authority. So that means the police power and military. She calls it concepts. I don't know. I think it's pretty much the same as aspects, but maybe not. I don't know. So since the categorically, so Christian anarchists categorically reject the use of violence, and that is probably why they focus and use a lot the word government, because that is the part that's coercive and violent. The administrative role of the state doesn't really do that. It's more like in the social contract. You have a contract that says you can take 10% taxes and use it for whatever, hospitals, roads, and etc. Christian anarchists also denounce the state as authority, though only really in the sense of it being morally corrupting by encouraging a type of hypnotic hypocrisy through the reproduction of social roles that obscure the violence of the system. So, in other words, the role as authority is it's kind of like a deception. It lulls you into the belief that you are agreeing to the state or the government to control your life. So, yeah, I think I've pretty much already mentioned most of the things that are here. So he's going back here again and talks about the inconsistencies in the choice of terms across the Christian anarchist literature. But he comes back to Kinna again and says the concept, the government delineated by Kinna, better captures what Christian anarchists mean by state than authority or power. So, but again, he says that government and state are pretty much used interchangeably, but government is pretty much the part that encapsulates what Christian anarchists mean by the state. Government is not the administrative aspect, but the governing aspect that's irks Christian anarchists the most. Here's another problem that he raises, is that the word state is a modern word, and it didn't really come into play until the Reformation. However, there have always been situations where human beings giving or ascribing to themselves the power to legislate and to use violence to enforce this legislation. And that happened long before Jesus. We have talked about, we haven't really talked about it, we know that there are in ancient Greece, what they call city-states. Not that I know a lot about them, but the term or if they even used the term state about those. I don't even know that for sure. But definitely the manifestations of them have been around for millennia, probably. Just like anarchism has been around for millennia before anybody even thought about naming it anarchism. So yeah, it's the same thing going on. So everything that has been written about Christian anarchism has pretty much been done in the last few hundred years. So when we talk about Christian anarchism or state, it's the modern state, the state that exists after the Reformation, and the modern state hasn't really always been what we have now. I'm pretty sure that the Reformation may not actually be the marking point there, because definitely in the Middle Ages there was no democracy in Europe at the time. It was all absolute monarchy, and I'm pretty sure that the absolute monarchies was in the majority way into the 18th century. Several hundred years after the Reformation happened. So Kavanaugh is one of these writers who talks about how the modern state came into being, and he contends that to call the wars out of which the modern liberal state emerged wars of religion is an anachronism, for what was at the issue in these wars was the very creation of religion as a set of privately held beliefs without direct political relevance. So the wars that came after the Reformation were really about religion, private religion, not about political issues at all. But the church came out of this whole thing weakened. And the monarchies basically won, and we see that definitely in Danish history, that the monarchs would play the nobility and the church against each other to see where could they get the most support, because in those absolute monarchy doesn't necessarily mean hereditary monarchy. They were still definitely in the Middle Ages elected by other noble people. The nobility, for example, would vote who was going to be the king, and whoever could gather the most support would be absolute ruler. But out of these wars, he says, came, but that these wars were in fact themselves the birth pangs of the state. So they were the beginning of the state. They weren't really the state themselves, but they were the beginning of it. And this is where the church begins to lose power, culminating in the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648. So we're talking about like 100 years after the Reformation or so. Fueled by war and the spread of nationalism, the state's centralization of its administrative power and extension of its monopoly over the legitimate use of violence accelerated with little opposition. So this is how the secular state won power over the church. Church power diminished from that point on. So, yeah, this is a little bit of a difficult chapter to dissect, but we can get back to it if there's anything that you need to clarify. The next 4 weeks, I think we will go into some details about the state. And again, it was about, first week we're going to talk about the violence of the state, the government. And the second week we will talk about the deception. And finally, the economic exploitation that came out of the state. And finally, the state as adultery. So I appreciate your coming. Thank you for listening, and I will see you next week.